Proud, ruthless and deadly, the Sons of Horus are masters of war, with an instinct for independent operation and a knack for sudden, precise and devastating violence. Today I'm going to take you through my process of painting a battle-worn, realistic and grimdark Horus Heresy Sons of Horus Marine. In this video I'll cover a variety of weathering techniques, including adding texture, the use of chipping medium and adding physical damage to your miniature. I'm Black Chalice Studio and you're watching the Grimdark Compendium. As a first step in achieving the war-torn and realistic look we're aiming for, we're going to add some texture here. This first pass will be with AK Interactive Muddy Ground. I apply this directly from the tub with an old brush towards the lower portions of the armour plates, and I quickly swipe off my brush and feather away the hard edges. I'll focus most of this texture to where dirt, grime and mud would normally collect, so around the feet, the bottom of the greaves, and places like that. You'll see here that I'll come back for a second pass on certain areas just to reinforce that texture a little bit more. Our second texturing pass is going to be AK Interactive Corrosion Texture. I'll thin this roughly 1:1 with water and apply it to the metallic areas of the model, such as around the bolter and the areas on the backpack like the vents. When I've completed the initial pass, I'll go back again with a slightly less diluted mix just to reinforce certain areas. You'll see here that I've taken a little time to go back in and add some physical damage. For this I use a sharp scalpel blade and gently scrape, scratch and push at the plastic to create small dents and scratches. Just go slowly here and work your way around the miniature. You can add as much or as little as you like. Now that the initial weathering is complete, this is how we look. Moving on to the priming stage, I use Stynylrez Res Black. I apply 2 to 3 thin layers through the airbrush at around 25 to 30 psi. Now we need to lay down a base colour for our chipping. For this I use Vallejo Hull Red. Again, we build this up slowly over a few thin layers through the airbrush. Now that the chipping colour is done, I'll leave the model for a couple of hours to fully cure. For the chipping medium stage, I use AK Interactive Worn Effect. I apply this lightly over several thin layers through the airbrush at around 25 psi. The aim here is to build this up gradually and to cover all of the chipping colour that we laid down earlier. When you've applied enough, you'll notice that the armour has a slightly satin sheen. This is what we're looking for. Here I'm just using air through the airbrush to dry the layers of chipping medium. We don't want to introduce any heat here, as this will cause the chipping medium to cure and become unworkable. I'll leave this to dry for around 5 minutes and then we'll come in with our first armour base colour. This is a 50-50 mix of Vallejo Emerald Cockpit Green and GW Cabalite Green. I'll build this colour up through several thin passes through the airbrush in a zenithal manner from above. For our second armour colour, we're using straight Vallejo Emerald Cockpit Green. I focus this more towards the tops of the armour plates and where light would naturally fall from above. For our final armour colour, we use Pro Acryl Bright Pale Green. This is just used as a spot highlight to emphasise the areas where we want the most light. After around 10 minutes, we'll come back in to begin the chipping pass. I'll come in with a brush and some clean water and dampen off one armour panel at a time. Whilst the area is still wet, we can come back in with our tool. Here I use a short bristled brush and an airbrush needle and begin to create marks and chips. The key here is to try and make this look as realistic and natural as possible. Avoid any repeating patterns or things that will draw the eye and look unnatural. Slowly work your way around the miniature here and try and concentrate the chipping on areas that naturally gather the most wear and tear. Chipping medium can give some very realistic effects, and the marks that are left show up extremely well later in the painting stages when we get to enamel washes. Once we get done with all the chipping, this is how we look. I now like to leave the miniature for a few hours to properly cure before we move on. Now we start moving on to the really fun parts. To start with, a unifying wash of Goon's Grime, diluted 1:1 with mineral spirits, and applied fairly generously, but don't allow this to pool in the recesses. You might notice here that I've blacked out the trim and the other areas of the miniature. This isn't something you have to do, but I like to just to separate the areas from each other. After applying the first pass of our unifying wash, we'll move to the blow dryer for 10 to 15 seconds on a medium heat, just to flush off the spirits. Because I really wanted to push the aesthetic that this guy's been fighting in prolonged and devastating battles, I've gone back in with a neat Goon's Grime pin wash, just to add some more grime to certain areas like deep recesses. Now we move on to the next stage, which is the removal pass. For this, I'll use a Q-tip just lightly dampened with mineral spirits. My initial removal pass is going to be quite light. I just want to reactivate the wash and remove it from the raised areas and places where I want less of a pronounced effect. As always, the key to the reductive technique is to use soft and gentle dabbing and tapping motion. Try not to push or pull your Q-tip across the surface of the miniature, as you can scrape through the underlying layers of paint if you're not careful. When our initial pass is complete, we go back in with a slightly more focused second pass, just to clean off certain areas a little more. Here I've gone back in and base coated all of the other details on the miniature. The silver parts are GW Lead Belcher. The gold parts are a 1:1 mix of Scale 75 Necro Gold and Vallejo Metal Colour Gold. The red areas are GW Mephiston Red, and the black areas are simply Abaddon Black. For our unifying wash on the details, I use a mix of 50-50 Goon's Grime and Ichor of the Damned, thin 1:1 with mineral spirits. My intention with the details, and in particular the metals, was to give them an old, battered, worn and tarnished look. To help achieve this look, after my initial wash, I went back in with an undiluted version and just placed it like a crevice wash around details, recesses and crevices. As an extra step to help push the weathered look, I came back in with a neat Goon's Grime application and applied it like a pin wash to the areas where I really wanted built up crud. I left this to dry for around half an hour and then came back in for the removal pass. I was very light with this, focusing only on the top edges and raised parts of details. I wanted the wash to remain in the crevices and the recesses. And once we get done with that stage, this is how we're looking so far. I left the miniature to dry for a couple of hours here before coming back in for the next stage, the highlighting. To begin the highlights for the armour, I came in with Vallejo Emerald Cockpit Green, diluted 3:1, water to paint. My application method for this is to apply small dots, lines and scratches along the leading edges of the armour panels and under some of the larger chips that were created with the chipping medium. I'm quite sparing with these highlights, focusing more towards the top edges and areas of scratches and damage. For the red areas, I simply came back in with some diluted Mephiston Red. For the metals, I used a 2:1 mix of Lead Belcher and Vallejo Silver, thin roughly 3 parts yet again, and applied in the same manner as the armour to the upper edges and prominent details. Highlighting in this manner helps us push the effect of worn, damaged and scratched metals. And finally, moving on to the golds, I took the original base gold mixture, added a touch of Vallejo Silver and thinned it down roughly 3 parts yet again. I applied this in the same manner as before, using small lines and dots to imply wear, tear, chips and scratches along leading edges. Now we're done with the highlighting stage, we can go back in, add some extra contrast and start working on those special effects. To add some much needed contrast to certain areas, I took Ichor of the Damned, thinned it roughly 1:1 with mineral spirits and applied it as a crevice wash. I apply this selectively and deliberately to areas that I really want to push the shadows a bit more, such as around details, rivets and joints in the armour. After a quick blast with a blow dryer, I'll go back in with a Q-tip, very lightly dampened with mineral spirits, and feather away any hard edges where the wash has dried. The satin look given by Ichor of the Damned when it dries will contrast nicely against the matte finish of the armour. To add another layer of visual interest and detail into the armour, we'll go in and apply some streaks. For this, I'll take some neat Goon's grime, lightly load my brush, and apply it in small, downward streaks starting from prominent details like damage or rivets. After leaving the streaks to dry for a few minutes, I'll come back in with a brush and some clean spirits, lightly loaded, and begin doing downward strokes either side of the streak we've just applied. The spirits will reactivate the wash and create a smooth transition either side. It may take a little bit of back and forth here, but just keep going and you can achieve some really realistic looking streaks. Another way to add visual interest to the miniature is by the application of colour filters. For this, I'm going to take Goon's grime, thin it 1:1 with mineral spirits, lightly load a brush and apply it almost like a glaze over certain areas. I'm going to concentrate this filter on areas that grime, dust and dirt would naturally build up over time and leave staining on the armour. We can layer this effect up in certain areas 2 or 3 times just to increase its saturation. After all the filters have been applied, I'll come back in with a clean brush and some spirits and just gently soften away the edges, creating smooth transitions. By gently tapping and dabbing at the areas we applied the filters with the brush and some spirits, you can create some really nice mottled effects as well. We're now going to come back in and reinforce those areas of glazing with another colour filter using Dirty Down Rust. I'll dilute this roughly 1:1 with water and very lightly load my brush and glaze it onto certain areas again, not covering all of the Goon's grime from the previous step, just accentuating it and hitting certain parts. Because we diluted the Dirty Down with water slightly, it's going to dry with a more orange finish, which is a nice contrast against the green of the armour and blends well with the Goon's grime from the previous step. To soften the edges of this filter, we just come back with a Q-tip and some water and gently tap and dab at the edges until there's a soft transition. And because we're using water to blend the Dirty Down filter, you'll get some lighter patches in there as well, some bright oranges and some yellows. Carrying on with the Dirty Down application, we can move into our next effect, which will be the rust. For this, I'll dilute it 1:1 and use it like a crevice wash. I try and keep the gun relatively clean looking and concentrate more of the rust on the back of the legs, the power plant and the vents on the backpack. With the backpack, I wanted to push the rusty look even further, so I applied 2 and sometimes 3 layers, gradually building them up, aiming towards more of the crevices and the areas where the metal meets the armour. I'll also come back with a neat application of Dirty Down just to emphasise the areas where I want the oldest, most crusty rust. For the removal pass on this rust, I use water on a Q-tip and gently feather it away from the raised edges. On certain areas of the previous application of Dirty Down, I'll go back in with a brush and some clean water and gently dab it on. The water will react with the Dirty Down, causing a colour shift from the reddish brown to a more orangish light yellow colour. Once we've got the rust step complete, this is how we're looking. We can now move on to final detailing and the last few effects on the miniature. For the lenses on this miniature, we're going to go for a subtle glowing effect. To begin with, I'll paint the sockets in black and then the lenses in Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White. Use a fine tip brush, some slightly diluted paint and a little bit of patience here. Then I'll take Vallejo Fluorescent Orange, dilute this roughly 2 parts water to 1 part paint and glaze this over the eye sockets several times. The final step is to dilute the fluorescent even further and apply multiple thin glazes to the area just under the eye sockets. By applying multiple thin layers, we can slowly and subtly build up a glowing effect. Moving on to one of our final effects, I'll now go in and add some oil and grease stains. For this, I'll use a neat application of Ichor of the Damned, applied like a crevice wash around areas on the backpack such as the vents and the power plant, and also on the back of the legs around the metallic areas. By using Ichor of the Damned neat, it will dry with a glossy finish. This finish will help us in achieving that fresh, oil-slick look. I'll layer this up over several applications, giving a stronger and more pronounced effect. As a final effect here, and to give a little more visual interest, we're going to add some oxidation. I'll thin down Abtalung 502 turquoise lights, 3 parts spirits to 1 part paint, and apply this as a focused crevice wash. I'll apply this wash to crevices, recesses and around the rivets as shown here. When it comes to the removal pass, I use a brush and a Q-tip with some spirits and just gently work around the edges of where I applied the wash. The final step on this miniature is going to be adding one last area of surface finish variation. To contrast against the matte armour and the glossy oil stains on the backpack, I'm going to come in with Vallejo satin varnish and hit the pouch on his back and the gun casing. To create a simple yet effective urban rubble basing scheme, before I prime the miniature I glued down some mixed grade gravel and sand. My initial dry brush layer over a black base coat is Vallejo Tire Black. I build this up over several thin coats using a lightly loaded brush. For our second dry brush layer we're going to use GW Storm Vermin Fur. This is also built up in 2 to 3 thin layers. For our final dry brush layer, we're going to use Pro Acryl Bright Neutral Grey. With this colour, I'm going to focus more on the larger rocks and pieces of debris on the base. Our last step in making this base look like part of a ruined and destroyed city is by adding some pigments. I start off with MIG Russian Earth and apply this dry straight from the pot to the majority of the base. I then follow this up with a layer of Ashes Grey from Abtalung 502. This is a dry application again, and as I'm working the pigment into the base, I make sure to get some on the feet and the lower leg armour of the Marine. This will tie the miniature to the base, giving a more realistic finish. And here we have the end result, a worn, gritty, weather-beaten and grimdark Sons of Horus Marine. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. For many more like it, don't forget to head across to the Grimdark Compendium, where you can take an in-depth look at all of the techniques we've covered today and many, many more. If you head there now, you can catch a newly released episode 3 of the Crimson Grove series. Thank you for watching, and I bid you a good week. Keep it grim, and I will see you next time.